Okay, so we're going to finish chapter 5 today. Review will be Wednesday, exam will be Friday. I've put up a narrated PowerPoint for the first part of chapter 6, which is the kind of structure of the heart. Yes, chapter 6 is cardio. So we can talk about that later in the week, but that's all, and then we'll jump into lecture 2 of chapter 6 next Monday. I think that's the right way around. I put up a new schedule, hopefully some of you saw that, and then over lunchtime today I put up the midterm rubric and the final rubric for the physical activity logs. So if you've got questions when you look at the rubric, give me a yell, because those are due next Monday. Okay? But hopefully you've been chugging along on those, and we'll have those ready. Okay, so the last bit of the information is looking at how does the signal actually travel down the nerve, and then some of the adaptations that we see within the nervous system with regards to different training programs. All right? So the signal, the impulse, the action potential. Okay? Remember that it's an electrical signal. So it's just like if you stuck a voltmeter into a plug hole, you'd get an electrical reading, right, in millivolts. If you stuck a voltmeter into the nerve and the nerve was transmitting a signal, you'd see a change in the electrical signal, the level. All right, so we have a resting membrane potential when the nerve isn't carrying the signal, and then we see a change in that resting membrane potential as the signal travels down the axon. All right, so the signal moves by changing the ion balance between the inside and the outside of the nerve cell. All right, so ions carry a charge, and so we look at the difference in the charges across the membrane. Okay, so again, we have the idea of a threshold that we have to meet in order for this signal to transfer. Okay, and when we look at the resting membrane potential, for example, right, if this is the membrane, then on the inside of the cell, we've got mostly potassium at that point, and on the outside of the cell, we have mostly sodium. But across the membrane, the balance in ion charge when we're at rest is minus 70 millivolts. Ish. Okay. So the difference in the charges leads to the action potential, and the way that we get a change in the balance here is by opening these little gateways. Okay? So when we depolarize the membrane, that means that the signal can move along the membrane. So when we depolarize, we open a channel, a little gateway, and we allow sodium to flood in to the cell. Right? And that changes this balance, and so we change from minus 70 to another number. All right? Guys, if you need to talk, go outside, please. Right, so we depolarize the membrane, that's the signal moving along the membrane. Well, once it's depolarized, for another signal to come along, it has to go back to rest. Right? And that's repolarization. So when we repolarize, we open another gateway and we allow potassium to leave. But this happens so quickly, right? Really fast. So here's a slightly more elaborate version of my gateways, all right? So here's depolarization. We open the sodium channel and we allow, oh, they've got it the other way around. They've got outside here and inside here. So we open the sodium channel, we allow sodium in, but the potassium channel is shut at that point. And then to repolarize, we open the potassium channel. But this is the bit that to me is more interesting, right? Because you think about that and you can kind of get it in your head, okay, these channels are opening, the ions are moving backwards and forwards, that changes the balance of the charge across the membrane, right? But when you see how quickly this happens, it becomes really kind of mind-blowing to me, right? So this bottom dotted line here is resting membrane potential. All right, so in this diagram, they actually have it just under -70. So it's about -68 here, right? Then we depolarize. When it depolarizes, in this example, it goes up to almost 40. So from -70 to 40 millivolts. But this is the thing that's shocking. Look at that. 1 millisecond. Just under 1 millisecond for that massive swing in charge. Right? Then we repolarize. And when we repolarize, what it does is it drops down below resting membrane potential. And then it pulls itself back up again. So at this point here, we have 3 sodiums moving out, 2 potassiums moving in, and that brings us back to -70. Right? Surprise, surprise, not. We use a lot of ATP to do this. Right? So to open and close these ion channels, these gateways, takes almost 50% of the ATP that we produce in order to see muscle contraction. Right? So 50% of that ATP that we've been talking about all semester that we create through System 1, System 2, System 3 is going to allow the action potential to move down the nerve and across the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. Right? So remember our sequence for this charge. Okay, we've got an electrical charge down the nerve. Right? So this is all electricity. When we get to the synapse, what happens here? How do I get that charge across the synapse? What do I have to use here? I'm going to turn the electricity into So we use chemicals to carry the signal across any of the synapse, right? The chemical, the fancy name for the chemical is a neurotransmitter. Anybody remember what the neurotransmitter is if the synapse is the neuromuscular junction? Good. ACH. Well done. Right? If I get enough neurotransmitter connecting to the protein receptors on the next excitable membrane, then I stimulate another electrical signal. Right? So it goes electric, chemical, electric. Right? The interesting thing about the neurotransmitters is that they can work one of two ways. Okay, they're either going to be what we call excitatory, which is what ACH is. All right, so excitatory neurotransmitters, and ACH is one of those, right, stimulate depolarization. So they stimulate this bit on that curve. Right? Then we have inhibitory neurotransmitters, and they prevent depolarization. Right? So sometimes your brain might not want all the nerve signals transmitting and causing contraction. Right? So sometimes we have inhibitory neurotransmitters as well, that when they come across, they block this, and then the next part of the signal can't occur. Right? Question. When you're looking at the information in this chapter, the book can get quite complicated on the chemistry and everything, all right? In all the chapters really, but in this chapter in particular, it gets a little bit heavy on the chemistry, okay? This is the level that you need for me, right? So, if when you're looking at this information, having more info helps you, right? Because sometimes more information clears the way and makes me understand what's happening. That's fine, but you won't need it all for the exam, right? If when you look at the chapter, all the extra information is like, oh my God, what's going on? Ignore it, right? Stick to this and this. Okay? You don't need all the additional info. Because that textbook, we could use that textbook at the master's level or at the PhD level, right? That's the thing with XFIS textbooks. They're not really very well directed at a particular group. They tend to be global, right? So don't waste time unless it helps you learning some of the material that is more advanced than what we've covered here. Okay? All right, I know last week we had a brief conversation about nodes of Ranvier and myelin sheaths, so we're just going to review that a little bit so that we've got an idea of how the myelin sheath and these nodes help that action potential. All right? Because without them, we would be much slower than we are. Okay? So the myelin sheath is a fatty substance that wraps around the axon of motor nerves and some other nerves, but not all nerves in the body. Okay? The cool thing about the myelination is that it speeds up the action potential, the time it takes the action potential to move down the axon to the muscle fiber by up to 140 times, right? Massively increases the speed of that signal transmission. Okay. Nerves that don't have this myelin wrapped around them have to stimulate every segment of the nerve all the way down the axon, right? But what the myelin sheath does for us is it allows us to have what we call saltatory conduction. Okay, so it looks like you probably have seen a way more better diagram than this. But let's say this is our axon, right? And we're going to have, okay? So the myelin wraps around, so this is a cross section, right? So it wraps around, but it's got these little gaps in it. The gaps are called the nodes of Ranvier because Ranvier, bless you, was the researcher who found them long time ago, like in the 1800s or something, maybe even earlier, right? So history of biology is not my thing. But what they allow for is that because the fatty substance can't transmit the electrical signal. So now, instead of having to stimulate every single piece of the axon, the signal can jump. And that's how it speeds up. It's called saltatory conduction. If any of you are gymnasts, a salto is a somersault, and you have to jump in order to do a somersault. So saltatory, and that's how I do it. Right? So it massively speeds up how quickly this action potential can move down the axon, but also it means that I don't have to use all that ATP at every single section, right? So it also saves a lot of ATP because I only have to change open the ion gates in these little sections where there isn't any myelin in the nodes. Right? So it gives us two advantages. Right? When we see individuals with multiple sclerosis, I think I mentioned last week, right? That what happens with multiple sclerosis is that these myelin sheaths start to degenerate. And so now it has to move all the way down the axon. So the time from the signal getting to the motor nerve and the signal getting to the muscle tissue is much, much longer. And so it takes them a long time to be able to pick up their leg to take a step. Right? They're sending the signal, but the signal just takes much, much longer than for a healthy person to get to the muscle tissue. Right? Right, next piece of the pie. Now we've got a signal, right? And we've got the signal moving down the motor nerve. What's my definition of the motor unit? What's a motor unit consist of? Good. Motor nerve and all the muscle fibers that it synapses with. Right? So, the next piece of the pie, when we're looking at how the brain coordinates your movement and how it sends signals to which muscle fibers, right, is something that we call the size principle. Right? The size means the size of the neuron. Okay? So what we see is that our motor units are turned on, they're stimulated and recruited to contract based on size. We go from the smallest to the largest. Right? So that allows me to regulate the number and the size of the unit that I'm contracting. So which is the smallest motor nerve? Which one has the smallest cell body? Which one am I going to recruit first?
Type 1.
Good, slow, right? So we're going to have slow first. Then we're going to have fast fatigue resistant, type 2A. Then we're going to go fast fatigable, type 2X. So that means that I'm going to stimulate my type 1 fibers first, generally, and then if my brain realizes it needs a little bit more oomph to get the job done, it'll stimulate, it'll add on type 2As. And then if it needs more oomph, it'll go to type 2X. Right, so it depends on the job that I'm trying to do and my perception of the job. Okay. But it allows me some control over force production. Because I don't want, remember, this one's going to generate a lot more power, a lot more force, but I might not need that much power and that much force to get the job done. Another thing that we see with these muscle fiber types is that type 2s have much more ability to grow in size. So they've got much greater potential for hypertrophy than type 1 fibers. Right? So they can grow bigger. And this is why you don't see, if someone goes jogging, right, or you look at marathon runners, they don't have great big muscles on their legs, right? Because they're using predominantly slow motor units and type 1 fibers, and type 1 fibers don't grow easily, right? If you look at a sprinter though, right, sprinters are walking down the track like this because their thighs are so big, right? Because they've got piles of type 2 fibers, particularly type 2X. That's what makes them good sprinters. But then it's also much easier to build the size of those muscles. Right? So if you're training people and they say, oh, I don't want big muscles. So well, you're not going to get big muscles because we're going to do light weights and lots of reps. And so you're going to use more type 1s, and those don't grow so much. Right? So the benefit to the size principle then is that it lets me recruit the easiest motor unit to recruit because it's the smallest, so it has the lowest threshold, right? So when I send the signal, the signal doesn't have to be as much or as strong to turn on a number 1. Right? And I'm turning on the fibers that are fatigue resistant, so they're not going to get tired. Right? I'm not going to suddenly run out of steam if I'm using my type 1 fibers. Right? So predominantly for endurance activities and for daily living activities, we will turn on these first because they provide a better benefit. Right? It's no good going into Walmart and getting halfway around the vegetables and going, right? So we go into Walmart and we stroll around and we waste way too much time and money, but we're using the most economical muscle fibers. Right? Delays fatigue by using the size principle. However, as always, there are times when we have to break the rule, right? So sometimes you hear amazing stories in the media about some mum who parked her car on a hill and left the baby in the pram and the handbrake comes off and she manages to run around and stop the car, right? How does she do that? Because if I turn these on, I'm not stopping a car, right? If I get round to the back of the car in time to stop it squashing the baby. Okay? So there are times when we can overrule the principle. Right? That's really useful because if I'm a sprinter, whether I'm a swimmer or a runner, right, I've got to react to a start gun or a flag or whatever it is I'm reacting to start the race. Right? So if I'm in the blocks and the start gun goes and I recruit these, by the time I get here, everybody else has finished the race. Right? So what we do when we train starts is we train overriding the principle so that we can turn these on straight away and explode out of the blocks or off the little stool thing on the pool. Right? So ordinarily then, this is the rule. But when we need to, we can override the rule, right? So in the case of the mum and the baby, the adrenaline and the fear override the principle and she turns on these to stop the car, right? In the case of an athlete, the reason we have to train starts is because we have to train to override so that we can go straight here. Right? Does that make sense?
So like your flight response instantly activates your...
Probably would, yeah. If the danger was big enough, yeah. Yeah. All right. And then one more thing we have to understand about our motor units, right? If you remember back to the diagram last week where we had the two motor nerves right? And their attachment to the muscle fibers, right? When we reach threshold at the axon hillock, so if there is enough signal coming into that cell body for that motor nerve, and the summation of the signal at the axon hillock reaches threshold, that nerve will fire, right? The action potential will travel down that nerve. There's no halfway house. We either meet threshold and we see an action potential, or we don't meet threshold and nothing happens. Okay? If we reach threshold, remember the diagram, you want me to show you the diagram again? So remember, we've got signals coming down to the cell body for the motor nerve from all these different dendrites. Okay? If the summation of all these signals at the axon hillock reaches threshold, the action potential will be stimulated down this axon. Every muscle fiber in the motor unit will contract at full force. Right? So it's one or the other. Either they all contract because there's a signal, or none of them contract because threshold wasn't met. Okay? So this is just a picture of the size principle, right? So initially we will typically, right, if we're not training it or we're not in danger, we're going to initiate a slow unit. Then if we need more force to get the job done, we'll include fast fatigue resistant, FFR. And then if we still don't have enough force to complete the job, we'll include FFs.
So there's always stack, like, even though you start including the ones above it, you're still just stacking that on top of the slope. Like, it doesn't, see how the line like keeps going as you access the next one.
Mm-hmm.
So you still use all of them, but it just adds and adds. It doesn't
Yeah.
just, like, you would never get to the point where you were just using one.
Well, if you override it, then you might just turn these on to achieve the job.
That would be like a split second thing.
Yeah.
How long does it take to train that?
I just, one of the things we see with strength as well is that when you don't train, you see a decrease in neural transmission. So I'm thinking that if you're an elite athlete, the reason they keep practicing those is to keep training this idea. But I don't know how long it takes to learn to override it. Some of that has to be this as well, I think. That idea that we had of fatigue and willpower playing a role in how much force production we see. So that, you know, knowing how fast I have to get out of the blocks to beat everybody else. Or knowing that I'm not that fast out of the blocks because I don't have, I don't know. Right? But I'm really fast in the last 10 meters, so I can catch everybody up. Those kinds of strategies are way outside my knowledge field. But I know when you look at sprinters, or any racers, but particularly sprinters, some of them are fast out of the blocks, and then they try to hang on for as long as they can, and others are a bit slower out of the blocks, but they build speed as they go, and then they can overtake near the line. adaptations. This is really, really cool. Fascinating stuff, right? Because now, not only do we see adaptations that we talked about in the previous chapter within the actual muscle tissue to training, we see adaptations within the neural system to training, right? And it depends on what kind of training I'm doing. Okay, so remember that adaptations are typically positive, all right? My body is going to adapt at the thing I'm training to make me better at that thing, right? Adaptations are rarely negative except for something like overtraining. So if I'm doing strength and power training, what I want to be able to do, because at no time will your brain allow you to contract 100% of the muscle fibers in any one muscle, right? You would blow your arm up or your legs up, right? So that never happens. We never contract 100% of our muscle fibers. But if I wanted to increase strength or increase power, it would help if I could turn on more motor units at the same time, right? So I was contracting more muscle fibers all at the same time. Does that make sense? Okay? So that's one of the things that we see occur, right? If I've got, so submax neural drive is how much motor unit recruitment and the rate of action potential generation, okay? We can increase the activation of a muscle with training, right? So if I want increased contractile response, so I want more fibers contracting to generate more force, okay? I can improve activation of the muscle. And we do see that. But the research suggests that even more than that, what we see happen is this efficient recruitment pattern. Right? And another adaptation that we see is increased maximal neural drive. So the motor unit recruitment and the speed at which the action potential is reaching the muscle fiber increases. So this is really interesting when we think about the application of that idea. Because if you take a beginner who hasn't done any weight training, at least for a long time, right? So either someone that's stopped doing lifts or a beginner who hasn't done weight work. And you take them to the gym and you put them on a resistance program, right? A lifting program. Think about what you would expect or what you have seen if you've been in that situation, right? If I take my person into the gym on Monday and I give them a workout, right? We're going to use quite light weights and we're going to, assuming they're healthy, right? Quite light weights, several different exercises. We don't want to make them too sore. We know they're going to be sore, but we don't want them to be too sore so that they don't come back, right? We give them Tuesday off, we have them come back in again Wednesday, and we do another session with them on Wednesday. And then maybe we do another session with them on Saturday, right? If I pre and post tested strength, do you think if on Sunday they would be a little bit stronger than they were the previous Sunday. Yeah.
But wouldn't you say they'd be
Little bit.
stronger, but not because of the muscle growth,
Not
but it's more
because-
because of the neuro
Yes.
contact to it?
Right? So over the course of the first few weeks of training, someone can get quite dramatically stronger, but we don't see any increase in their muscle size, right? So they didn't get stronger because their muscles got bigger and there were more proteins contracting. They get bigger because of this improved neurotransmission and recruitment of motor units, right? So when we look at this graph, okay, the blue line is my improvement in strength, right? The orange line is the change in neural factors, and the green line is hypertrophy, increase in size. So this is 8 weeks to this first dotted line here, all right? And most training studies that you'll look at will be either 8 or 12 weeks, 8, 10, 12, somewhere around there. Anything less than that, they would get probably not published for not having done enough work in the gym, right? But if we see here at 8 weeks, there's very little muscle growth at that point. But we've got a significant increase in strength, but it's tied to this increase, although that plateaus before we get to 8 weeks, but it ties to this increase in neural factors. Right?
So would you say that links into like what you would perceive as their form? That allows them to like, a lot of people like say, or like trainers when you first get to the gym, that if you can like improve your form fast, then you'll see like the amount of weight you can lift improve fast as well, and you'll feel stronger. But like a lot of it's to do with like maybe on the neural side of it, links in like you like improve your like technique, which improves like how your muscles.
You improve, the brain improves which units it turns
like,
on
improve,
to achieve the job.
Yeah, that's why like
Yes.
your muscles don't get bigger, but like use like more.
It's a motor control issue,
Yeah.
right? So it learns to turn on
The right
either
muscle.
different motor units to achieve the job
Yeah.
or more motor units to achieve the job, right? So we see this increased motor unit firing. We see synchronization of motor unit firing, right? So I fire more motor units at the same time, and that generates more force within the muscle. Right? But we usually do that by turning on type 2s, and then they fatigue really quickly. And so we've still got to train those fibers to get them stronger, right? We need them bigger, we need more glycogen available to them, right? And just as you were saying, Craig, when you look at skilled power athletes, their recruitment patterns, which motor units they turn on at which time within the skill, are very, very different to someone who's a beginner at a skill. Right? This means that they're more mechanically efficient, they're more energy efficient. Right? Now, it's a very different picture when we look at endurance training, right? Because to be an endurance athlete, I don't need to generate as much power as I can at one time. I need to be able to keep going for a long time without getting fatigued. Right? So we see a different pattern occurring in someone who's a trained endurance athlete. Instead of synchronous motor unit contraction, we see a trend towards asynchronous motor unit firing. Right? So our low threshold motor units, remember, are going to be our S, our type 1 fibers, and we see asynchronous recruitment of those fibers. So if we think of it, think of the cross section again, right? Right? Let's say they're all type 1 fibers. Okay? So to run, I need to turn on 3 of these. I'm making it up, right? But I'm going to turn on that one, and that one. And that's going to generate enough force for me to run relatively quickly for a period of time. Right? Now, if I want to run more quickly, I'm going to have to turn on more of these. But if I'm running at the speed I want, and I want to keep going for 4 hours, right? The adaptation is not to turn them all on at the same time. The adaptation is, okay, this one's done its job, we'll give it a rest, let's turn this one on instead. And this one's done its job, let's give it a rest, we'll turn this one on instead. And this one's done its job, we'll give it a rest, we'll turn this one on. Right? So what we see in the muscles of endurance athletes is this asynchronous pattern that allows a motor unit to take a bit of a breather for a while and to regenerate and let the proteins relax back out, right? Because if we get too much overlap, I can't contract anymore because there's nowhere to go. So we want those muscle fibers to relax back out so that I can recreate cross-bridge formation. Right? So it's like a built-in rest phase for a certain group of muscle fibers. Right? And then the last place that we see adaptations when we're looking at movement is actually within the neuromuscular junction. All right? We know that we see fatigue at this junction, either because we run out of ACH on one side in the axon of the motor nerve, or we don't have enough receptor sites on the other side, on the surface of the sarcolemma, and so we've got acetylcholine kind of pooling around within the synapse and nowhere to attach to, right? So all of that causes some fatigue at that junction. Okay? So we see a couple of things happen. The size and the dimension of the neuromuscular junction increases. Right? So that allows me to have more little boxes in the axon to hold ACH. They're called vesicles. Right? It's like a little pocket that has the ACH in it. So if my neuromuscular junction increases in size a little bit, I have more vesicles and more ACH available to carry the signal across. Right? And then we also see an increase in the number of protein receptor sites on the sarcolemma. So now there's more receptor sites to accept more ACH, and we reach threshold faster. Right? When I stop training, I don't suddenly lose muscle mass. takes a long time to lose muscle mass. Right? So if I'm a big athlete who can't get a shirt on, that doesn't improve straight away when I stop training. Right? I have to wait a year, 2 years for that muscle mass to break down. But it does not take very long for me to not be as strong as I was when I was training. So I still have big muscles, but they can't do the job anymore. And the decrease in strength is mostly down to changes in these neurofactors, in the same way as the initial increase was due to changes in neurofactors. All right? Fun stuff. Fun, fun, fun. All right, so remember, Wednesday is review. Okay? Go over this stuff. Come with questions. If you need me to go over anything, let me know. Make sense? Good.
Friday's the test.
Friday is the test, yes. So if you've got a race or anything, just let me know. We can reschedule.
Okay, we're done for